But then why do terrorist groups even occur? Some say it's because states allow them to, or they use them for other state reasons and interests. We all know the case of Al-Qaeda and how it came to be, and then how it backfired for the US. And then now ISIS, how the countries of the area allowed it to come to be as it is, and how it backfires now. So how can the states that allow them to come to existence disrupt their existence or destroy them?
That's a very good question. Just to pick up on something that you and Zenonas said, it's the huge shift in the demographic situation as well as the human geography of Europe in particular, and the absence of effective migration and integration policies based not on the actual needs of a given country, that has led to the marginalization of whole peoples and so on. And this has created some relatively fertile ground for the rise of extreme violence. So as we said, this is a multi-leveled issue, and the response has to come from many sides, right? It's from the state level. It has to be measures have to be taken. The operational and the institutional structure of the state has to be enhanced. The civil society must remain vigilant and aware of the new threat. And
how feasible all of this? How tangible is this idea?
Well, it's...
I'm sorry, because we've seen states trying to fight terrorist groups for years now, and they had the insight, they had the experience from previous attacks and organizations, but then mistakes are not only being repeated, but they're getting worse.
I think that's a key point there, because the key point is that mistakes are being repeated. So it's not like we may have constructed or built or developed good intelligence services, let's say, but this is not the solution to the problem. This is a measure that we can take to minimize the cost, to contain the threat of terrorism. What we need to do is for the West, for example, to disengage where it can, because it cannot disengage from everywhere, to disengage from conflicts in the Middle East, which are largely to blame for the terrorism that we're seeing right now. States also need to, as Nikolas very well said, to take into account marginalized migration policies and see how certain groups of people of the society can be better integrated, not assimilated, integrated into the society, and create the necessary conditions for everyone to the possible extent to prosper and to have a decent life. Because if in the absence of a decent life, of decent living circumstances, people tend to be drawn by extremist ideologies, and it's not only Islam. It's also fascism. It's also nationalism and Nazism. So it's a very multi-leveled issue that needs to be dealt with in a multi-leveled way. But we cannot be effective unless we understand that different states are applying double standards when it comes to terrorism. So you cannot, for example, be dealing with Turkey as the EU, deal with Turkey and reach an agreement on the migration issue because, for example, you fear the great influx of migrants and the terrorist threat that stems from it. And at the same time, have a main role in what is happening in Syria, which also creates the problem and intensifies the problem. So you're trying to fix a problem that you, at the same time, you're causing. Mm-hmm. This is what we need to address, I think.
Is this an unfair, quote-unquote, fight for states? Because we live in the era of globalization. So states need to work together in the closest way possible now. Borders have been blurred in a lot of ways and different levels. So they have to deal with their own interests. They need to deal with their own enemies, but at the same time, be a team player and take account other states, fellow states or ally states' problems and interests and all that. But for terrorist organizations, they only have one enemy, and that's that state or that group of states.
Yes.
Is that an unfair fight for states? Can they handle it? Can they juggle all the balls together?
I think that there's a good possibility that they can.
Why don't they though?
Why don't that's again a huge question to answer briefly, but I think that interstate cooperation between states is the number one requirement for combating terrorism.
But sorry, we have the US. I'm taking the US example right now. They're fighting ISIS. They're trying to contribute every way they can, but then Saudi Arabia goes in Yemen and bombs everyone and they say nothing. But then when Iran takes some of their, I think 10 of their Navy people or army, and suddenly all hell breaks loose for 24 hours and we need to... That's double standards. How
Exactly.
How are you going to convince your allies that I'm going to be fair to you when you're not fair in other cases?
Yes, that's a rhetorical question. I mean, nobody can really give a proper answer to this question. It's fundamentally it's an issue where states must come to a common understanding that terrorism is not a strictly geographical issue, right? It's a global issue, and everyone is affected. Everyone is potentially affected anyway, more or less. So states must come to an understanding on a global scale that terrorism must be combated in its its root causes must be addressed, right? But purely from a security perspective, and just to be cynical, it's not a matter of when and where terrorism will take place for the foreseeable future, but the real question here is how quickly the actor is to be taken out, right? Before the victim toll rises up significantly.
Minimalize damage.
Yes, exactly. Because it's going to take place. That's not a question, it's a non-starter. So we have to address the question of how states can increase their cooperation in a way that they exchange information and intelligence on near real time, and so that they can increase their capacity in addressing this phenomenon.
We have the Al-Qaeda example, and it's the greater example that we have, closest example that we have to ISIS in terms of magnitude of actions. Al-Qaeda was essentially self-destructed way before the US had taken out the leader. And we see that ISIS now has risen all this expectation for the Islamic world, for the Islamists that share the view of the Islamic Caliphate. But then again, we see them losing ground, losing followers. Is the only answer that we have against terrorist organizations, and not terrorism as a whole because of what you just explained, their self-destruction?
It's quite impossible to self-destruct completely. So I don't think this is something that we can count on. And also, I should say, and this is probably not very politically correct, but the Islamic Caliphate is not really the biggest threat in itself. The biggest threat is the idea, is the notion of an Islamic caliphate. So it's not the Islamic caliphate as we know it right now, but it's the notion of it and the possibility of having an Islamic caliphate. So even if we are able to defeat this caliphate, the existing one, the so-called caliphate, then we are still faced with the possibility that another one will emerge, perhaps somewhere else. This might be in the Sinai Peninsula, it might be in Libya, it might be in Nigeria, it might be in Indonesia. So the problem that we have to deal, in my opinion, the primary problem is the issue of ideology and the roots of this extremist ideology. And it's not religion in itself, but it is, as I said before, the social, economic, and political conditions that allow for this ideology to take an extremist form. From there on, ideology works as a filter of everything that happens around it. So even a person develops this ideology that we're talking about and it's surrounded by bad situations, then it will filter all these situations through this extremist ideology and then take an action accordingly, which will not be a peaceful action. It will be a terrorist action. It will be a violent action. And in the context of extremist Islam, the outcome will probably be what we see right now in Iraq and Syria and elsewhere. And even if we defeat the Islamic State, we won't be able to get rid of people who carry the same ideology, not only in the Middle East, but also in Asia, in Europe, in America. And that is the greatest challenge of all, which makes this threat truly global, as Nikolas said. So it's not a regional threat in this sense alone. We do have a conventional threat in the Middle East right now, but we're also faced with a primarily asymmetrical global threat that needs to be dealt with primarily through social, economic, and political means.
So my last question and your final comments would be about ISIS. They're losing ground. They're losing followers. Where's that going to lead us? Are we at the beginning of the end? Are we just taking a break towards something even greater? Your thoughts?
Two things on that. The first thing is that ISIS has gone global, right? And this creates some, may potentially create some problems for the organization itself. So it becomes more exposed to counterterrorism efforts globally. It requires high level of command and control structures. So this eventually can turn against the organization itself. I mean, going global. It's not accidental that Hezbollah and Hamas are the most successful terrorist organizations over the last 2 decades because of the fact that they have not gone global on such scale, right? They act locally, and should they go global, they pick their targets very carefully. The second thing is that, and more worrying, I would argue, is the fact that sleeper cells globally, I mean the clandestine networks that are affiliated to a given organization, have passed on to another stage from where they used to have a more supportive role, a more clandestine role, where they were focused on, they would focus on issues like logistics and providing arms for the terrorists. They have passed on to a more operational role. The thing is that they increasingly gain their autonomy from the mother organization, and they are now in a position to carry out attacks themselves without having direct communication with the mother organization. And this is a problem that we have to address, is hitting these clandestine networks in wherever they are.
I believe that, to address your question head on, I believe that the Islamic State is absolutely defeatable. The reason it has not been defeated yet is because of clashing geopolitical interests and because it does serve the interests of certain actors of the international system. However, I believe that even though it is defeatable precisely because of the reasons I just mentioned, it has a potential of becoming a legitimate political actor in the Middle East. We might even see it sitting at the negotiations table at some point in the future and actually be given certain territory in the context of a settlement in Syria or Iraq or in the greater Middle East. But even if that doesn't happen, and we manage to defeat the Islamic State and it disappears, I still believe that if we don't take the necessary measures, the necessary political and social measures, that we will see it, definitely we will see it emerging again, perhaps with a different name somewhere else.
Thank you so much for your time and your insight.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching.